We told him.
There's another seat up for you.
I don't know.
Four seats in here with his name on it.
So this is Margaret Flowers with Popular Resistance speaking at the United National AntiWar Coalition Conference, and we'll get started in just a moment for a workshop on U.S. aggression towards China and Russia. As you are probably aware, the Great Power Conflict is the national security strategy of the United States, targeting countries like Russia and China. So we're going to learn about what that looks like, and what we can do to resist that and bring peace. So folks are just getting settled, and the presentation should begin soon. Hang in there. We're at the People's Forum in New York City, and this is the third day of the United National Anti-War Coalition Conference. If you want to find more information about it, you can go to the website unacpeace.org. That's UNAC peace.org. Our speakers here. And, as soon as our moderator is ready, we'll get started. So, while we're ready to get started, if you want to share this to your own Facebook page, that will let other folks know what's going on. And if you go to the UNAC Facebook page, you'll find live streams from the last couple days in the various panels and workshops. Ready?
We ready to start?
Yep.
Good afternoon, and for everyone who's here, this panel, I think this will be a very interesting discussion, and it is a discussion that we want to frame in terms of the title and remind everyone it is focused on U.S. wars, U.S. threats against Russia and China. There is also a discussion tomorrow evening where I think we'll be able to go into more depth with some of the same panelists on Monday at 6:30 at the Solidarity Center here in New York. But we really felt for this discussion, and as part of UNAC as a coalition of forces that oppose U.S. wars, that we really, in this period, have to address the wars that are right in front of us, the threats that are right in front of us. We've seen the last several decades where U.S. threats, 800 bases around the world, tens of thousands of U.S. troops, and the nuclear firepower, along with other massively destructive firepower, that can destroy the world. But it has been targeted on countries that had no weapon of defense against these U.S. tactics. And this is true certainly for Iraq, for the almost 2 decades now of occupation and war in Afghanistan, for the massive NATO destruction in Libya, for the huge 100,000 mercenaries that flooded into Syria in efforts at regime change, of the sanctions that have just shredded the social programs in Venezuela, of the countless efforts to overturn the government in Nicaragua. This has been U.S. threats of this period. But there is a new stage that is happening, and it is met with enormous amounts of propaganda. First targeting, of course, Russia. There was a whole expansion of NATO into every country of Eastern Europe, right up to the borders of Russia with the coup in the Ukraine. Really an overthrow of an elected government using the very same tactics that we have seen against many, many other countries. And now we have seen, really in the past year and a half, a nonstop onslaught against China. There is not a day where you open, I'm just going to raise the New York Times, there are 5 or 6 articles a day of very vicious propaganda onslaught against China. And that's usually at least 3 articles on average in the news section, at least 1 article in the business section, and almost always 1 article in the arts and culture section. So this is the average coverage in the U.S. media, and it's backed up in social media platforms. It's backed up in all sorts of organizations that are really funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and many other organizations that base their funding from them. So we wanted to have a panel that would address what these attacks on both Russia and China are. What's the character of them? Because we certainly feel that propaganda coming at us nonstop. And we want to be able to arm ourselves to address it and also come up with the beginning of a real discussion of standing up to it. And so the panelists who are here today have done an extraordinary amount in print, on radio programs, in delegations to combat that level of what really amounts to with China today, a racist onslaught where literally even every Chinese restaurant, tour groups, all kinds of things that have nothing to do with this are now feeling the weight of this racist attack on China, where they're being blamed for a virus, and we know how viruses and the flu impacts us here, but you know, this is turning the world on its head. So we want to address that also. That's a very important part of it, but we saw it earlier in the year and the past year with coverage of Hong Kong, with coverage of Xinjiang. So different organizations have picked this up, rammed through resolutions through Congress that impose sanctions that were absolutely unilateral. That's important to recognize too, what happens when sanctions now are not only against countries that have absolutely no ability to respond, but what happens when they are against economic powers who exist within the capitalist world order in terms of banking and finance and trade, and yet literally do have the means by connecting with other countries perhaps to respond. So there are a lot of questions in this, but let's frame it from the point of view of the U.S. war threats. Now I'm going to ask K.J.Noh to kind of lead off this discussion. And KJ is very much a peace activist focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. He comes to us from the Bay Area and has a very important Pacifica radio program there. He also writes for Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, and he is an active member of Veterans for Peace, and there was an important effort through Veterans for Peace to stand up to this propaganda from the U.S. So K.J.Noh, and then we will also be having Soo-Hin Lee on this program, and Kevin Zeese, who very much, Soo-Hin Lee has organized delegations to China in this recent period and has a whole network and list, and Kevin Zeese from Popular Resistance has really done so much to collect very valuable material. So this is quite an exciting panel, but we're going to ask KJ to lead this off.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very honored, and it's a great pleasure to be here with everybody. I'm just going to start out very quickly. You should all have a little post-it in front of you. Could you just shout those out to me?
Ames.
Yeah.
All at the same time.
One at a time, just, yeah.
Ames?
Yes. Somebody else. Yes, good. Yes.
Carol.
Yes.
Casey.
Yes.
Eagle. Edwards.
George.
Henry. Toby.
Humphreys.
Kim.
Mobile.
Moses.
Nimble.
Tango.
Yongpyong.
Kansan.
Walker.
Red Cloud.
Page.
Okay. Does anybody know what these are? Anybody want to take a guess? I'll give you... Sorry, no, not close, yes?
George Jackson.
George Bush.
No. Close, yes.
Code?
Bases?
Yes, they're bases. Okay. These are names of bases, and these are just bases on the South Korean peninsula. But we would actually, just to name the bases in Korea, we would need about another 100 people.
Wow.
And then if we were to name all the bases currently that are encircling China, does anybody know how many there are? How many bases are encircling China?
Outside its borders.
Yes, outside, well, there, yes. 6?
80.
80?
300.
300? Sorry?
400.
We think at least 400 bases armed to the teeth surrounding China. And that's not even counting lily pads, which are these kind of temporary bases that they can take on immediately. Another question for you. In the U.S. Congress, how many bills are there currently opposing China? We know very recently they passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy, blah, blah, blah Act. That's one. But how many bills are there currently opposing China?
Dozen.
A dozen? Just a guess.
20.
20.
400.
That's a good guess. There are actually 112. There are 112 bills in Congress against China right now. And you can imagine the Chinese look at that and their heads are exploding. So this is where we're at right now. I'm going to ask one more question and I'm going to start going into my presentation. This is a quote. It's a direct quote. We will know when our disinformation campaign is complete, when everything the U.S. public believes is false.
Kissinger.
Who said this? It's
Kissinger.
not Kissinger. Who said
Brennan.
that? Brennan. Who said this?
What was the?
Barack Obama.
Yes, good guess.
McNamara.
There was a PR guy from the early 20th century.
No. That's a good guess, yes. This is 1980.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, Abrams.
Brzezinski.
It's actually William Casey, the head of the CIA. And he was in dialogue with Ronald Reagan. Okay, this is a direct quote. We will know when our disinformation work is complete, when everything the U.S. public believes is false. Okay. And this is the situation that we are in right now. Almost everything you hear is false. I sometimes like to think of like Karl Marx had this image of a camera obscura. You're kept in complete darkness. And there's a tiny pinhole where you get images from the outside. And when you do get those images and they're projected on the wall, what are the images like? They're upside down. They're exactly the inverse of what is actually true. Okay? So this is the situation that we're in right now. Currently, the United States is at war with China. And when I say it's at war, it's not a rhetorical trope. It really is at war. And the thing we have to know about war is that long before the bombs start dropping, there is a long campaign of disinformation and information war. So this is the situation we're in right now, and I want to go over very briefly some of the history that led to this, because I think the history is instructive, and then we'll engage in a dialogue. So very quickly, there was the fall of the Soviet Union, and then in 1992, there was a very interesting document called the Defense Planning Guidance Document that was leaked This was Wolfowitz, yes, during that administration. And it spoke about full spectrum dominance. And one of the key things that it said was that the United States had to prevent any rivals from arising to challenge U.S. global hegemony, and that it would engage in aggressive or preventive war to head off this challenge. And then it talks about low-yield nuclear weapons, full-spectrum dominance, revolution in military affairs. And this document is later disavowed, but it becomes the basis for the project for the new American century. This is the neocon project. Okay, we know something about this, correct? The PNAC, or the Project for a New American Century, talks about the U.S. being a global constabulary force, the world police force. It should have the capacity to wage simultaneous wars all over the world. It should control space and cyberspace. These are battle domains. And of course, they said we need a new Pearl Harbor, which just happened to occur. China ascended to the WTO, and it started developing very quickly. It started to develop in the range of 9 to 11% annually, which is to say that if some of you were starting your job in, your first job in the 1960s or 70s, currently most of you would be billionaires if we look at that same kind of incremental increase. The Chinese have had a model of a state-planned, infrastructure-based development, and they've done something which is almost unforgivable in the eyes of the West. They've created a system of development which is not neoliberal, and it's not Western. Before, the notion of modernization and development was synonymous with the notion of westernization. If you developed, you had to become Western, and of course you had to become capitalist. Okay. The Chinese broke that mold. This is an existential philosophical threat. Okay. Now there's another piece to this, which is a geopolitical dimension. And this has to do with something called Halford Mackinder's pivot state. Does anybody know about this?
No.
Okay. Yes, the pivot state. Yes, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Right.
Well, the pivot, Alfred Thayer Mahan was a geographer, and he wrote in the early 20th century, he said that the Columbian era was coming to an end. The Columbian era, meaning the era starting with Christopher Columbus, the era of Western imperialism was coming to an end. And he said it was coming to an end because he said that prior to the Columbian era, the control of the planet was through control of the oceans. You look at all the powerful imperialist countries, what they did was they controlled the navies. Their navies controlled the world. Mackinder said that the Eurasian continent was going to be the center of development. And with the development of oversea rail and oversea transport paths, that you would have 60% of the world's population and most of the world's wealth being integrated into a single block, and this would be the new center or the pivot state of the world. And he has a little maxim. He says, "He who controls the heartland controls the world island," meaning Eurasia. He who controls the world island controls the world. Okay. And this theory has trickled down into all U.S. geopolitical strategizing, including Kissinger and the great chessboard, all of that. This is something that they fundamentally understand. And so in 2012, or actually starting around 2011, Hillary Clinton said something very interesting. She said, I don't want my children to live in a world, my grandchildren to live in a world dominated by the Chinese. I don't want my grandchildren to live in a world dominated by the Chinese. And she, along with the Obama administration, declared what is called the pivot to Asia, or the Pacific pivot. And notice the term pivot, it comes directly out of Halford Mackinder. And essentially what this did was, a declaration of war. And there's a war doctrine associated with it. It's called air-sea battle. And now there are specific other war strategies that have been developed. RAND has developed one. It talks all about controlling the South China Sea. And it also started the movement of 60% of U.S. logistics and military force into the Pacific. The new GSOMIA agreements, the THAAD missile defense systems, the new bases built in Jeju and Okinawa and everywhere else, new military agreements, new military intelligence sharing agreements, new military exercises. And this is accompanied along with what is called, we would refer to this hybrid warfare. Okay. Hybrid warfare involves, first of all, information war, media war. It involves perception management. It involves tech war, which is why you see the US going to war with China over Huawei. It involves lawfare, which is the use of the courts and legislative measures to attack and delegitimate another country. And with the best example of this was the South China Sea lawsuit, which was a complete farce. But this is one of the ways it's done.
Could you explain what that was?
Later. It also involves economic warfare. It involves overt military planning. And as we see over the past few years, there's been this constant escalation. In 2015, there were terrorist attacks in Mali. Do you know who was killed in these terrorist attacks? In a hotel. There were
Chinese people.
They were Chinese. They were the top Chinese executives of the Chinese railroad system. These were incredibly experienced negotiators, and who had decades of experience doing work, negotiating contracts in Africa. All of them were killed, along with Russian logistics experts. Okay. Okay. These things happen. We don't know who's responsible. It was a terrorist attack. Okay. Recently, the daughter of the CEO of Huawei was kidnapped. Okay, and this was something completely unjustified, because what she was doing was not against. This is a relationship between China and Iran, and it was not a breach of It was not a breach of UN sanctions, because they were allowed to do that. It was not a breach of Canadian sanctions, because the Canadians were not upholding sanctions against Iran. But she was arrested on the pretext that Huawei, a Chinese company, had breached US sanctions against Iran, and therefore she was kidnapped. They were looking for her. She was going to travel through 12 countries and decided that Canada was the best place to nab her. And so we see this long-arm jurisdiction. Now, everybody in China is incensed about this, because this reminds them of one other important kidnapping. This is during the revolution, when Mao's wife was kidnapped. And this is, these are kind of medieval, feudal type conflicts. Now the thing is, Mao's wife never surrendered. Do not think that the Chinese are going to surrender over this. But I work in China a lot. I teach in China. I work with activists, social activists, social workers, teachers, and I teach political education and popular education. And this is from a Chinese social worker. She said, We have a good country now. We're not wealthy, but we are comfortable. Our lives are good. This is a good system. And if war happens, all of that will be destroyed. And we've worked so hard. Our parents have worked so hard. We don't want war. Tell your friends we don't want war.
Thank you very, very much. And I think this and this approach really very much help us in terms of framing.
I'm sorry?
Okay, so let me now introduce Hindley, who is a Chinese immigrant activist, and this is how I first met Zihun here in New York in terms of the Immigrant Activist Network. But he also, over many years, has helped to introduce to people in the U.S. China through delegations to China. And that has been, in many ways, I don't think enough people were paying attention to China, so these trips have been extremely helpful. He is the national coordinator of the National Immigrant Solidarity Network and also the China-U.S. Solidarity Network. And so, Stephen.
Okay. How's it going, yo, everyone? Give me some love. 大家好. Repeat after me. 中午好. I said afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Hindley, and even my name, how to pronounce Hindley, is colonial, British colonial. I'm from Hong Kong, China. And if Mandarin, I should be Li Xiaoxuan. It's a different way to pronounce. And it will not funny because that is how the racism works. That's how you label it. I maybe talk a little bit later. But first, very simple about myself. I am a fifth-generation migrant around the world. My family have been traveled many parts of the world as a migrant, at least 2 countries undocumented, and for 130 years. And I'm here. I was coming study and also become undocumented. I work in a sweatshop in downtown LA 20 years ago, and then I've been involved in social justice movement since 1970s from Vietnam War. Believe it or not, I'm much older than I look like. And I involved in, when I was an undocumented worker, I was involved in the anti-globalization protests from D2K and also LA to DC, and then also the anti-war movement. And also I was a Pacific reporter, KPFK, Los Angeles, WBAI. I was also war correspondent, went to a dozen countries from Bosnia, Iraq, Angola, Mozambique, with my own money, and I know it sounds crazy, but that's the reason. I might be slightly different perspective how that has been, because I've been working in grassroots since 2008 when Obama elected. I fled the country. I know there's will be going to bad things going to happen, and I didn't believe about that. Many people agree that. Then I decided that also at that time I sensed that U.S. is going to want to wage war against China. That's decided I'm going to China to do something. So I work and travel between U.S. and China to do a solidarity work, and then I have a network of activists, officials, academia, Maoists, and all these different groups of people in grassroots level I know, and then we work together with the U.S. activists. That's how we also building this network, and also brought the delegation, include you and some other people, went to China and meet with them. So enough of me. And going back, this is since World War II, only 3 countries in the world defeated U.S. You know which 3 countries?
Vietnam.
The other 2?
Afghanistan now.
Almost. If they include 4 countries, so
Cuba.
no,
Korea?
Yeah.
Korea, and China. So only countries in the world able to military defeat U.S. military might since World War II was everyone in Asia. That's the reason when people say there's a quiet Asians or maybe or even small in fact in significance that is bogus, and so there's a very strong will. That's the reasons, and there's been a war and Cold War not only because China is a socialist country run by Communist Party of China, but also in the same time that because China has a very strong from Vietnamese, Korean, a very strong will, and that will against imperialism. So that's not easy to defeat. That's one of the reasons. Then when they use the tactics again, the military might has a little difference. So now we're talking about this. I said from the trade war to coronavirus. Why they're doing this? It sounds like we're talking. This kind of topic should be maybe going to NYU Business School to talk about. But this is nothing but the political and geopolitical struggles, which is I want people to understand this is not something about economical issues and then or maybe a public policy issue. That's a difference. The very simple reasons is because China and Russia have some other country different than from Nicaragua to Afghanistan or to Iraq. Doesn't have. You know what? One thing that U.S. really afraid of China and Russia. What they have?
Technical.
Sovereignty?
Technical.
Nuclear bomb. Nuclear bomb. That's the reason why North Korea is would determine to develop nuclear bombs. That is a risk that really the U.S. is really scared about. And then there's a strong military, large country, and then strong will. So by simply talking about going to maybe sending several thousand military, just like they cannot invade and overrun a country, like going back to 100 years ago when the Boxer Liberian or the British troop marching to Peking and then just burn a couple palaces and there were total surrenders. Not going to happen again. That's the reason they need to use some new tactics, especially after the millennium, when after September 11, W invade Afghanistan and Iraq and miserable failure. Then, in the world, that's what they're saying happened. Because U.S. invaded Middle East, it gave a golden opportunity for development for China and Russia. And that was one of the highest developing time in last 20 years. Both Russia under Putin and China under Hu and Xi. That's been a very high growth rate. And that's when U.S. seems dropping significantly, and then the GDP for both countries has been increased dramatically with more new technology and more prosperity and more new weapons and all this kind of weapons program. So now China have 2 aircraft carriers and all that kind of things for self-defense. That's the reason U.S. is not going to, like simply speaking, 10, 20,000 people just marching and then can be overrun the country, or maybe just going to do a coup d'etat that country will change. It's not going to happen. That's the reason they need to find something new. Why how they finding out? I always, maybe because I'm going back, I'm a war correspondent. So sometime I recently go why they said going back to Nicaragua when Oliver fought about how they fought about the Iran-Contra gate was Oliver figure out that on the bathroom when they pee. I think the same thing. Probably there's some crazy people on the behind and then maybe on the pop and drink and stone and then thought about something cool idea that let's try every week. So that's the reason right now every week the bashing Russia campaign or anti-China campaign every week seems like irrational and changing every week. Must be policymaker behind. They just keep thinking about something new, crazy, want to see what's happening. So from so they decided that trade is a good idea. because when you after 2002, after 2000 and 2003, because the U.S. is losing war and spending so much money, economy is getting worse, and then China is getting really prosperous on economic after the entering the World Trade Organization, and then just if you see all this data, just U.S. beat every production and every economical indicator on that couple of years, become the #1, overrun U.S. by #1. So they thought, okay, that is an idea. So that's the reason they start from a trade issue, ranging from so-called sweatshop issues to labor right issues. Then, if just only talking about sweatshop labor rights, it's not that enough. That's the reason there's always packing a new covert operation. That's also the picture when I was entering. I remember on 2003, 2004, when I was undocumented sweatshop workers also working, I was studying, and then so I'm a student labor activist. That time when I met you, one of the organization, labor union and youth organizations, invite me to talk privately, want me to run a student labor activist program in Hong Kong, because I'm from Hong Kong, and to do an independent labor campaign in mainland China, and funded by National Endowment Democracy. And that was I immediate alert. And at first I say no, then they keep nicely talking to me. The second time I say no, they become very nasty. And then people know me very well that when I really get angry, I'm not fucking quiet Asian. I threaten them back. I threaten them back, and then I expose them on the media because I'm from Pacifica. And then that made them mad, and I got very serious, credible threat against me. And that's a close to death threat. And so that I know that time they're not just fucking around, just they are really seriously want to do something. And then later, the same program, but they want me to do, they find someone else to do. That was the beginning of the so-called Hong Kong riot. And then what they were doing was later known as the Color Revolutions. They want to apply the same tactic has been using an anti-globalization movement to become some kind of youth-based so-called social justice movement. That was I'm very surprised. That's the reason I determined that I go back and forth between China. That I know that now they want arming to the teeth. So that when they try to do this kind of color revolution, kind of like a smear campaign, a media campaign, didn't work out, then they got to find something more new than going back to not just talking about labor right, because that was a more like a Bush era idea. Then first get into Obama, doesn't seem work, and then they're getting more like a more high tech kind of area. So they're targeting state companies and major companies, and none of them they really care about workers. If they really care about the workers, because I work in a sweatshop, I know who runs the business. They're not targeting them at all. And they're targeting the one which is against the U.S. imperial interest. So they are targeting now, talking about the state companies and then that kind of things. They want to be really push the Chinese government, same thing the Russian government, to be maybe will back off or surrender, or maybe what they always a fantasy is they thought that maybe just going back to like maybe happening on 1988 on the Philippines and 89 in China, some kind of social uprising and movement, and then can be from bottoms up, and then the whole society will become chaos, and then top will crumble, and then you can have a simple coup d'etat, and then now become a U.S. friendly puppet regime. That was what they were thinking about. That's what they always remember. They thought about maybe state company crumble, and then maybe the leadership may be going to have like internal fight and coup d'etat. So every time when you read the New York Times or all that kind of thing, they always think about some kind of crisis. Then top with that is some kind of top government official internal struggle, and then beating up each other, and they're going to have some kind of regime change coming soon. That is always that's fantasy. So I found these people must be the stone on the thing about that's going to work or something like that. And that's a don't was bad, but then it doesn't work. Then they put in the trade war. Then when the 45th become president, then they push more trade war. Trade war is not the same thing. It's nothing to do with trade. They want to crumble the government, and then also they want to destabilize the country. And then plus sponsoring the riot in Hong Kong, which is totally CIA sponsor. And then also the terrorists in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is another story, which is most of the Uyghur are supporting the China, the central government. The one who is separatist is primarily sponsored by Turkey. People know East Turkmenistan, and then the biggest money exporter for the Xinjiang independence primarily from Turkey and the U.S. And then many of them trained by ISIS. Then many of them, when they fled out, when they left, there's the last couple of years, 1,000 left China. Where they went to Syria to join the ISIS. And now the ISIS almost dismantled. Now they now become refugees in Turkey. And then very sensitive issue. So most people didn't know about it, and then they want. So they, on one hand, they want to maybe hope there may be some kind of like maybe a Syria type of disasters. It's kind of like a civil war in Xinjiang, and then maybe another kind of like maybe some kind of independent movement in Hong Kong, and then Taiwan, and then a country that will crumble and then maybe become some kind of Honduras kind of like a military dictatorships or whatever that were friendly with U.S. and then going back, pushing back a country to 100 years ago, become a completely weak and can be surrounded to Western country undermined. That's always what they want. So when this doesn't work, the trade war, when Trump pushed the trade war, and then it didn't win. And then it's also hurting the U.S. economy. And so this shit didn't work. So they got to find something new. So that's the reason the coronavirus virus, that's got to, they always call this, now it's called, it's almost like gamblers mentality. I put more hand on that, pushing more and more further races, and then hopefully that can be that something they didn't win on trade war, they can win on coronavirus. But coronavirus, there's been have a lot of talk about from the left to right. There's also some crazy conspiracy theories that are from a military lab or that kind of bogus things. And then they want to make it sound like this is China virus, and that has been coming from a military lab from China, and then now the accidentally spread to Wuhan, and then they're going to destroy the human race and autocracy kind of things. And then they hope that can be work, and then become a really anti-racist campaign, China campaign around the world. Hopefully that can be, again, the whole top ideas want to be crumbled, the central government, so there were all these rumors that she is now sick, and then a coup d'etat, and then incompetent, and those kind of thing. All this kind of weird rumors are flying all every day, which is completely false. But they never talk about that in China, the people have been effort to going to combat the disease, and there have been thousands of volunteers, thousands of workers, not even mention tens of thousands of military personnel went to the city to support the combat the virus, and the overwhelming majority of people support that. That's the reason why you see the whole society is very calm and supportive, although they're locked down in the room, because we know a friend, one of the activist friends from US now living in Wuhan, he's been stuck on the room, his apartment for last month, and then it's fine. He's supposed to understand. And then I do medical work, so I know my medical friends going to Wuhan right now. Yesterday, I got a call from one of my lady friends. She is going to send it to Wuhan coming week. One thing, she's very beautiful, long hair. Why I just mentioned that? Because every medical worker, when they're going to Wuhan, they need to chop their hairs. So that means she's going to be just probably going to bald head. But she's determined to do this. And going to do that. So there's a strong will to do that. I mean, I feel bad. I know how to ask her, are you going to chop your hair, beautiful long hair? But they're all determined, they're set to do that. There's a different philosophy. In this country, you know how many people kill by the influenza flu every year. Do you know how many people can?
70,000, 80,000.
Yeah, there's tens of thousands every year, and no one care about, no one talk about it, and there's a cure, there's a vaccine that they're not care about this kind of things, and the flu thing is going to be now it's also that the spreading. No one doesn't know. Some of them could be just because human transaction, but this is not from China. This is global issues, and then they want to frame this as they want to see this is they want to win this kind of propaganda war. I think that's not going to happen, and then they might be thinking about something new future. But we've got to be understand this is not just simply about talking about like an economical issue or public health issues or something like that, and this should be a more bigger picture that they want to have a launch, eventually want to launch a military campaign that's going to about one kind of a final fight, and then a crazy idea they're going to launch a war with China or Russia. That's what they're thinking about. Thank you.
Very good.
All right, so you can see this is already shaping up into a very interesting panel, very different even style and approach, and yet enormous amount of information and perspective. So we're next going to hand it over to Kevin Zeese, who from Popular Resistance. But I think really, and this is true for each of the panelists, they're also doers. They also make challenges. And really for both Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, the action at the Venezuela embassy in defense of the people of Venezuela and against a US-sponsored coup is very important. But also, and their continued defense. It's a responsibility of the movement here. But even during this time and during all of the meetings with lawyers and all of that, it was very interesting to me that Popular Resistance continued to accumulate an incredible number of articles and information and enter into this debate, because these are the big pictures that at the same time that we defend Venezuela against a US orchestrated coup, an enormous level of propaganda and lies and total frauds, and an effort to create internal dissension and simply appoint a leader. We see the same thing, of course, being attempted, which I think Suhin just really defined the effort, the concept to try to apply it in China. So let me turn this over to Kevin Zeese now, and then we're going to turn it over to the room here, because I think there are so many ways in which we can view this. So Kevin.
Thank you. Well, first, thanks for organizing this panel. When we started talking about the UNAC conference, you and I talked about this panel because I think it's so important for UNAC and peace movements in the United States to get very clear on China and Russia. The U.S. national security strategy is now great power conflict, and we've talked about how this is a hybrid conflict, and it's a propaganda conflict in part that affects all of us and is already confusing people in our movement. So I think it's really important for us to try to get as clear as we can about this. And I wanted to go last because I knew that both these panelists would have deep knowledge, and so I would have to say a lot less because they would cover so much. I'm just going to focus on a few things. First off, the U.S. cannot win a war against China and Russia. They can do a lot of damage. I mean, we can't win we couldn't win a war against Venezuela, and to talk about a war with China and Russia is absurd. And as was said, the nuclear bomb would be part of such a war and could affect the United States, lower 48, and that's got to be something of great concern to Pentagon war planners. So a war, I think, on that grounds is unlikely. But I do think there is an ongoing war already happening. And the great power conflict, is a hybrid conflict, but it's not just the U.S. having hybrid powers. China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, these countries that are targets in this conflict also have hybrid powers. China has a lot of U.S. debt. What can it do with that? Iran can control the Straits of Hormuz. What can it do with that? Russia has been, at 10% of the cost of our military budget, has developed weapons that make our whole defense planning obsolete. And so we're losing the hybrid conflict. The U.S. is losing the hybrid conflict already. China has been at the top of the GDP since 2013, measured by PPP GDP, Purchasing Power Parity GDP, which many people think is a better measure. Since 2013, they've been at the top. They will be at the top on the more traditional GDP measures in this next decade. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure people are aware of, which will, as was mentioned by KJ, the connection between Asia and Europe through what's called the Middle East, through Russia, through parts of Africa, that is a gigantic economic engine and political engine that will become the dominant force in the world economy and remove the United States from that position. And the United States is reacting in almost a flailing way. They see the empire failing, they see hegemony ending, they see economic dominance ending. And in fact, there was a report put out by the Pentagon, was that 2 years ago, Margaret? 3 years ago, about the end of unilateralism. And the Pentagon's response to that was, we need more weapons, we need more military power, we need more of the same, rather than recognizing the inevitable reality. And so, the U.S. is flailing in that it is trying these economic sanctions, which affect,
America.
a third of the world. It's already, and you see as a result of that, a negative effect for the United States, because countries are finding ways to get around U.S. economic dominance, taking the United States out of trade. The power of the U.S. Currency as the global trade currency is shrinking. The power of the SWIFT system, where global economics goes, is shrinking. And so as the U.S. fights this hybrid war, it's actually weakening itself. And so over this time period where China's been growing in this century, the U.S. has been hollowing out its industry, its employment. The empire economy has not been working for the United States any longer. It's been, when you have an empire, you have to keep the countries that are part of the empire happy. And you have to keep the capitalists who the empire is for happy. And that's a conflict with what's best for the United States. Because it's best for the United States capitalists, the transnational corporations, to go where the cheapest labor is, and not to pay union wages in the United States. So this is it's a strange situation, but it's almost like we're in quicksand. The more we try to get out, the deeper we go in. And it's a negative spiral that the United States is trapped in. And so this Belt and Road Initiative is developing. I think it goes through the Muslim territories of China, and that's why we're seeing all this propaganda about how Muslims are treated. I mean, we've covered this, by the way, on Popular Resistance in great depth. Both Hong Kong, KJ and I did some work on Hong Kong together, but we also covered the Muslim territories. And so if you really want to figure out what's going on there, we've got some great authors who've explained it very clearly. I think we really need to be up to speed on that because the propaganda is so deep. But the Belt and Road Initiative goes through that area. Syria is involved in this. Iran is involved in this. And the Belt and Road Initiative is just that, all these conflicts. If you try to figure out why the U.S. is in some of these conflicts, look to the domination that's going to come from the linking of China, Asia, and Europe through the whole continent. And that is just an incredible fear. So, I mean, we can't win the war. We're losing the hybrid war. And we are afraid to face up to that reality. And so we're doing insane things. We are escalating a nuclear arms race. We're escalating a weapons race in outer space. And we're pulling NATO along with that. Trump's attack on NATO, which I think has ended up actually resulting in strengthening NATO because more European currency, European funding is going into NATO. NATO is rethinking its mission. It's including outer space in its mission. It's part of the conflict with Russia. And so Europe is being pulled into this. And at the same time, they're getting pulled in a positive way into the Belt and Road Initiative. So even Europe is having this very conflict. Because at a certain point, it's going to become evident to European powers that they have to break from the United States. Because their future is going to depend on being part of this Eurasia economic powerhouse. They're not going to be strengthened by the shrinking U.S. Economy. And so this is a very dangerous time, and that's why it's so important for people like us to be clear. I get very upset when I hear people on the left of the United States describe China as another imperialist country. In reality, China their approach to foreign policy is very different than the U.S. Their approach is a win-win approach. They want both countries that are in negotiations to be growing. The U.S. approach is not a win-win approach. The U.S. approach is for our transnational corporations to get cheap resources and cheap labor, and that's not a benefit to those countries. Bolivia would be much better off if it was in control of its future destiny for its own resources, so it could develop them and get the most out of that. If the U.S. goes in, they're going to be stealing those resources for weapons and electronics at low prices and undermine it. So I think more countries are seeing this, and the vice grip that the U.S. has through militarism and through economic domination is weakening. And as it weakens, the U.S. is going to get more dangerous. Different segments of the population get more dangerous. Bernie Sanders, for example, I looked at you because I thought of Bernie, because I know you're a Sanders supporter, but he's trapped. He's trapped with this Russiagate 2
Did you see today's
fraud.
New York Times headline? Seeking chaos, Moscow places its bets in the U.S.
Yeah,
It's the New York Times, Jay. This is the paper of record.
The same that New York Times, the same paper that drove home the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I mean, they've been lying for years.
Right.
You can go back to the Philippines and talk about some of their lies. I mean, so it's a long record of dishonesty, but Sanders is trapped. He has almost no choice but to say bad things about Putin.
But he doesn't mean them.
Well, you don't know what he means. That's one of the problems. There are peace activists in the United States. When Sanders says he favors he would do humanitarian war, he would do a first strike in North Korea, he would do all these war approaches. They just turn. Don't keep interrupting. They close their ears and eyes. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to know that Sanders is saying those things. They would say he doesn't mean it. And all they say, we can't criticize him when he's running for office. We have to criticize when he's running for office. But anyway, my point was he is trapped. Because this Russiagate 2 story, on which in the Washington Post, the intelligence bureaucrats are quoted saying they don't know what Russia's doing to help Sanders, but they definitely favor Sanders. It's such a fraud. But Sanders is then stuck. He can either say it's nonsense, and then he'll be accused of being Trump-like in support of Putin, or he can say I hate Putin, and then he's trapped in the anti-Putin camp. And what is that going to do if he gets elected? What's that going to do for relations between Russia and the United States and the Sanders administration? So it's a very dangerous trap, and we're going to see more and more of these as the U.S. empire crumbles. So I just want to end by saying I hope that as a movement and as an organization, the peace movement can be very clear in opposing the current wars, the hybrid wars, and the threat of militarism against Russia and China, as well as other great powers like Iran and Venezuela. And I think that we have to, when we see conflicts about these issues in our movement, we have to bring them out, discuss them, and get to a perspective where we're unified, because our solidarity against this great power conflict is essential at this time. So I'll stop there and take the questions.
This is really a rich panel, and our time is kind of limited. So I'm going to propose this as a way to proceed, and that is we can go around the room and take a stack. so that each person who wants to speak can speak at least once. That doesn't mean 5 times, and it doesn't mean for a long time. So try to encapsulate a question or a comment or a contribution you want to make to this discussion. And then I think we're going to ask these 3 great panelists to kind of wrap up this discussion. And the discussion can go other places too than what was raised, but this is important to understand the U.S. today as an empire that is in serious decline and decay. We feel it every day when we can't even get where we're going on the trains or the roads. We just know this. And we also see the effort of the U.S. to break every relationship they have spent 40 years cultivating with China. So professors and scientists and corporations that had thriving businesses in China are now being ordered to cease and desist. And scientists are being arrested here in the U.S. Chinese scientists and those who are not Chinese, who have genuine scientific exchanges with China, are now suddenly being arrested for stealing secrets, for exchanging public health knowledge. So it's a multifaceted, and folks here may want to comment also and have experience in some of these different facets, and I think that will also make it an interesting exchange here today. So let's take a stack, if that is agreeable, as sort of our. All right. Okay.
First start
Just
with
go
Camilla.
around the room.
Okay. Should we go?
Yeah.
I usually start with.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay, well, great.
Okay.
Thank you for a
Mia.
great panel.
And each person, by the way, introduce yourself, because this is a great. Wow, this is a great room.
My name is Camilo Mejia.
All right.
And I'm overwhelmed by the amount of questions I have for all of you. And I'll just say that I've listened to KJ's and Kevin's interview on Pacifica about Hong Kong at least 4 times. It's such a great, comprehensive summary. Gosh, I had so much to ask, but I think one main question that I have is that I see that the U.S. is really bent on using the Hong Kong, pro-democracy uprising as a way to, as part of its smear campaign against China. But I'm also wondering what other end goals can there be? Is this about creating a legal framework for legitimizing military aggression? Is this something about maybe grabbing the physical territory of Hong Kong from China? What can we expect? What kind of escalation should we expect to see in terms of the Hong Kong conflict?
Okay, and I'm going to hope our panelists are keeping track of these questions, so maybe they can. You won't be able to address them all. And by the way, if you don't have a comment or a question, that's fine too. Don't feel pressed. And that's an ideal way to handle. Keep it short so that we each do have an opportunity.
Thank you, sir. I'm Marty Salma, I'm Peace Liaison for U.S. Friends of the Soviet People. I think that we need to consider that the preparations for World War III are not just on the draft board.
That's right.
That we've heard today that the second front, which they will need for World War III, is even more massive than I had knowledge of. And that is essential for the launching of World War III, that the war has to be launched in the East as well. We know in the West, or that direction, the United States, the Obama administration refused to remove the missiles that it had in Europe when they had the deal with Iran. Instead of removing those missiles, as he repeatedly pledged, he armed them with the most advanced low-yield thermonuclear warheads. The next step in that was to extend the range of those missiles, so with the Trump administration, they've withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Treaty. They also have ringed the Russian Federation in Europe with numerous small biochemical warfare units. So the scenario seems to be pretty clear. I don't need to spell it out, how they would step. A nuclear attack, dissipation of the radiation, use of biochemical warfare weapons. Can we rely on some sanity in the Pentagon not to launch World War III? That's my question.
I pass.
Oh, I'll tell, can I get 3 times then?
No.
Good try.
I'm Alan Weineman. I'm sort of an independent Marxist. I'm a big fan of Counterpunch, by the way. I vaguely knew Alexander Coburn once upon a time. I flirted with joining the Democratic Socialists for a while until AOC started signing on to anti-China legislation, and Bernie made these terrible comments about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and stuff. Couldn't stomach it, so I don't even think I could vote for the guy anymore. Which is really serious for the American left, that the one thing they all buy into is all this anti-China stuff and anti-Venezuela. You wouldn't believe the great activists I know who believe everything they hear about Venezuela. It just drives me nuts. So anyway, but the other thing I think is important for us to deal with is this, people use the term Russiagate around here, like they don't think Russia could ever do something so devious as to try to influence our politics. But I think we're missing the point. The point is that the U.S. has been the standard bearer of interfering in other people's politics for 50 years. I mean, everybody knows we've overthrown like thousands of governments, and the NED specializes in buying off elections. That's what they're publicly funded to influence other people's elections. They call it promoting democracy, and everybody falls down and gesticulates. And, you know, so I mean, I really think that's where we need to focus, that issue. I mean, personally, I think the Russians could easily have done a lot of stuff over the internet. I mean, anyway, I don't see why people think that that's impossible. But the United States is the champion of this stuff, including cyber warfare. We made this massive attack on China, cyber warfare. I think it was with their nuclear stuff. No, that was Iran. With China, we did something else. But you know, we openly do this stuff, and yet Americans are so silly that they believe this stuff. It's crazy. So anyway. And the other thing, I try to study the Chinese economy to some degree because it's fascinating, like a mixed economy, you know, transition from capitalism to socialism and all this stuff. I mean, really fascinating stuff going on in China. But personally, I worry that they may go a little too overboard in terms of their facilitating private enterprise, both local and foreign. And I worry, my question for the panel would be, I worry that China is going to get themselves too enmeshed in the Western financial structure, which could end up being very dangerous for them, making their experiments vulnerable to more manipulation from Western, you know, financial shenanigans. That's a serious question to me. So that's what I want to say.
We're going to keep going around.
Next up, I'm Alice, and this was very powerful and overwhelming. I'm not enamored at all with Bernie Sanders as a candidate, but I'm supporting him because I want Trump out, and I'm wondering what other people think. I don't think we can sit the election out and be stuck with Trump again, which is a big possibility. I'll leave it at that.
I'm Richard Oakes from Baltimore Peace Action. My question is, how much development is China doing in Africa and Latin America, and what are the estimates of how that competes with U.S. corporations in Africa and Latin America, and what role do all the U.S. military bases play there? Are they part of the hybrid war, or are they going to try to destabilize China's development in those countries?
Mary?
Yeah,
that's Baltimore. This is terrific. This is important. There's stuff I didn't know, even though I should have known it. I kind of thought about all this. You know,
speak
there's
just
so
a
much
little
work
louder.
we have to do.
Speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There could be no
Elliott,
conversation
Baltimore.
here, please.
This is a terrific panel. It's really essential that we learn these things. Some things I didn't know and should have known, and heavy. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Cody from Portland, Oregon, with ILPS as well as Code Pink, and really honored to be here. Again, really feeling the unity we all have about this directly and militantly opposing World War III, which is what a lot of y'all are saying World War with China and or Russia would be. So I'm very happy to be here and join our arms in that struggle. And I want to thank all of y'all on the panel for really presenting what's at stake and really bringing those voices that we never see in the mass media. My question is kind of along the lines of Alan's question, which is when we're talking about sort of the economic activities that China is doing with other countries that really is the basis for it becoming this economic competitor with the U.S. Global economy, U.S.-driven global economy. I know one of the, a very strong, basic Marxist principle, especially when we're talking about an imperialist system, is that of national industrialization. So I'm just wondering, from the perspectives of folks on the panel, when we're talking about China's relationship with other countries, how much are we seeing is directly facilitating the national industrialization of these countries along the Belt and Road that the U.S. completely rejects? Or is this, in some cases, more capital that is actually being leaving the country and going towards China?
So, I think that when we talk about Hong Kong, what we're seeing is an attempt to reestablish U.S. influence on, close to China, which we certainly see with some of the floating military bases, the lily pads, things like that. And it's the same, really, gameplay that we had in the Ukraine, right? Where it was trying to seize those Baltic military bases, and that was why it was so important to shore up the relationship with the Ukraine. Obviously, one of the things that the U.S. doesn't like about either China or Russia is that they're both powerful enough that they are able to defy the U.S. hegemonic world order. And we see that in Syria, we see that in Venezuela. And what's clear, and what I feel uncomfortable about on so much of the left today, is the denunciations of China and of Russia as imperialist. Because when you look at the aid that was given to Venezuela and the aid that was given to Syria, that does not look at the way an imperialist country goes in and influences things. This is not a money-making proposition. This is not the exportation of capital. That being said, I do think there's significant differences between China and Russia today. China is still, despite I think the market experiments, a worker state. I think there's a danger of capitalism being restored, and I think that there needs to be political opposition to the Chinese bureaucracy. On the other hand, it is. The threat that it represents to the U.S. is similar to the threat represented by Cuba or the threat represented by Korea. That is, that it poses an alternative to capitalism, an alternative future. In Russia, counter-revolution has already succeeded. Putin, despite having come out of the old Soviet bureaucracy, oversees a capitalist country, but not an imperialist country. A country that's still based on the extraction of resources, right? Russia has its own oil. Russia has military technology that it's developed out of the legacy of what the Soviet Union had been able to achieve, and that has been privatized. So I think what we need in Russia today is something different. It is a new revolution. It is a new 1917. But I'll just leave it at that.
Hi, my name is Christoph from the Bolshevik Tendency. I would agree with some of the previous speakers that the aggression of the US towards Russia and China needs to be understood in the context of the decline of the American empire. It's declining economically, it's declining politically, and with it come the decline of the institutions that have traditionally been dominated by the US. NATO actually being one of them. NATO is literally falling apart. It is no longer a unified US-directed military operation. Here's one example. The US offered Turkey its THAAD missile system. Turkey went, maybe. They said, come on, take it. Turkey went, not so sure. They said, actually, no thanks. Turkey is, of course, a NATO member. They declined the US military hardware. Where did they buy? Russia. Yeah. They said, they've got better missiles, you know that? How did Turkey know that? Because they had watched the missiles being deployed in Syria by the Syrian army against the so-called rebels. Turkey knows Russia made better missile systems, so they went to Russia. The US was furious, of course. A NATO member declines the advice from the big brother, the US, to take their hardware. Unheard of. But this is how things are developing at the moment. So there's that threat, of course, that Russia is a player. Russia is not a player economically, but China is the second largest economy.
That's right.
And there is cooperation between China and Russia, which terrifies many people in Washington. Not the ordinary people who work for their living, but the people who run this country. The cooperation between China and Russia is the perfect marriage and creates a very strong counterbalance to the US. You have a very strong economy in China and a lot of resources, oil and gas, that Russia supplies to China. There is the threat. There's the competition for the US. And that is why we see such a strong aggression against those two countries. And just as a side remark, and I'll close with that, I think as revolutionaries, we need to side with deformed worker states like China and say very clearly, we defend these countries. We are not happy with the rulers of China, but we would militarily side with China in a conflict. And as for North Korea, another country that is, in our view, a deformed worker state, I am happy that they have nuclear weapons. Because if they didn't have nuclear weapons, they would have been taken out by the US a long time ago. Thank you.
Yeah. Dave Edwards. Well, of course, that might be true of Iran, and Iran giving up giving up any nuclear development is very dangerous, that, to say the least, for Iran. Israel exists with how many nuclear weapons? It would be the monopoly of nuclear weapons in the region. That's a side remark, sort of. But I was reading Bernie's website the other day, and he says that we have to get together with our European allies to defend and develop NATO to defend against Russian aggression. He said that directly. You can read it on his website. And there is a direct siding with Russia, with the NATO imperialism against Russia, and and this goes back just to comment on the overthrow in the Soviet Union, the implosion, and all that happened. The Yeltsin experience was a coup in itself.
That's right.
And the dismantling of the remains of the collectivized economy destroyed the economic development that had been occurring in spite of everything. And I still remember, by the way, the picture of Yeltsin in Time magazine, the front page cover, where he's got Yankee dollars coming out of his pockets and waving them. And he says, "Thanks, Yanks." That was after his election, where they decided to elect him. The IMF decided through Clinton to elect the guy they wanted. That's not meddling, you understand. But just a comment that, well, somebody commented during the meeting yesterday that there has been a transition or a change from the war on terror to the war on major powers. Yeah. And this represents a real danger to the whole world. I personally believe that there is a real danger of a nuclear confrontation. Yes, nobody wants it, like they didn't want World War I either, in the immediate sense. So, and just one comment. Look at the Nord Stream. Am I through?
Yeah.
Nord Stream pipeline, what that means.
Everyone,
Sorry
keep it
about
tight,
that.
otherwise the panelists won't have a chance to respond, although these have been great points. So.
Hi, my name is David Rold. I'm one of the candidates for the Green Party 2020 presidential nomination. And I really appreciated this workshop. I think this was one of the most excellent and important workshops I've been to for a long time. Thank you very much, all of you. And I have a question for Kevin. I don't see Howie Hawkins here. Could you please make sure that he watches he's like given an opportunity to watch this workshop, because I don't think that he shares the perspective that's been presented here. I've heard Howie like go along with imperialist mainstream media propaganda against both Russia and China. He's like expressed support for the protests in Hong Kong, as well as North Korea and Syria.
Are we using this workshop for negative campaigning?
No,
Well, it sounds like it.
I'm not. I would like. He might be the nominee. I would like whoever. I would like him to learn this stuff, because I would like whoever the Green Party nominee for president is to oppose World War III and oppose U.S. imperialism and not go along with anything that's going to support, that's going to be used as propaganda to support these the U.S. imperialist wars against Russia or China or any other country.
Okay, keep going.
Okay.
You want to say Okay, I have some questions. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm going from New Jersey. It would very much be from the beginning. I'm from north of Iran originally. I'm retired from 32BJ. I'm in art committee. From north of Iran, the last city to Turkey and Russia. I was born there, and after revolution, I was a candidate for parliament. One thing, that's why it's very important. I was born right on the Silk Road. My present house, my father's, is right on the Silk Road. When we were making, they found a lot of stuff, those things kind. Anyway, it's very important for me to know what's going on with this Uyghur people. We call Uyghur right now. So they are very much our ancestors. Azerbaijanis and those Turkestan, Kyrgyzstan, Istan, all those Istans. Okay, so what is going on with the Uyghur things, and it's very much I like to know, because I also want to know what is the difference between People's Daily and CGTN and all those sexy, fantastic females. It's okay, there's nothing wrong. But all this trouble is going on, and this is like another country. I'm sorry, Then even Chinese government, they don't go with those CGTN. I'd like really to know, is it private or it's government? In Venezuela, 6 months, they were like a mouthpiece of, while Maduro was a carpet welcomed by Xi and his wife, and kids were given flowers, and this CGTN is mouthpiece of two ladies for 15 minutes. These two ladies who were part of opposition, they had interview and they were rushing to go to Miami. And they said, our house is going to be here, protected by somebody, and their house is in Miami. And this all the time, those 6 months, that and America, people don't have really anything. Well, People's Daily, how many % Americans read People's Daily? With my eyes, I can't read all of it, or whatever other. That, to me, is they representing more Chinese majority working people, and they have 90 million party members. They can't find anybody to bring there, or why don't they hire from you? There are a lot of Chinese and non-Chinese Marxists, probably better than all of those people, analysts. I'd like to know how this can happen. And it's a very scary thing, because same thing with the Uyghur thing. Because I'm from north of Iran and I know about these things, it's not that difficult. Azerbaijan and all those Istans, they have fantastically worked, unbelievable, after the Soviet Revolution, with those Islam, dances, they took over in short time with no money. They are fantastic, beautiful, unbelievable shows and dances in Olympics, in the New Year's. They sense it. We don't see it here. Americans get crazy to see those people, you know, the way they you know, unmute people. You don't see it.
Yeah. So, Alan?
Yes, well, I'm glad we mentioned nuclear weapons, and I really appreciate the information I learned today from the panels. I've been to China on many anti-nuclear trips with the Chinese People's Association Peace and Disarmament, and to the Soviet Union with all the anti-nuclear activists. And when we're looking at this geopolitical economic model, I mean, we're not just at the end of the American empire, we're at the end of industrialization and capitalism. I mean, we have this climate thing bearing down on us. And if it's just going to be China being a competitor with the Western model of industrialization, we're in big trouble. I mean, we have to really shift the whole paradigm. And we also have to be very concerned. Like, I always appreciated China. They only had a couple of hundred nuclear weapons. They were quiet about it. They had no first use. The U.S. and Russia have like 14,000 of the 15,000 nukes on the planet. You know, and they're pointed at each other. They have like 25. It's not even deliberate. It could be an accident. There have been so many near misses. The world has just been lucky. So when we're talking about the peace movement and where are we going, we have to make that connection that, you know, it's not just against war, it's against industrialization. It's like protecting the climate, and that has to get into our discussion. And as far as Bernie goes, I mean, maybe he said a lot of hateful things, but I've heard him say at every rally that if he's president, he's going to get all the countries to the table and say, instead of spending $1.5 trillion on war, let's put all that money into fighting the climate. And I think there's some level of sincerity there. I don't know what he's saying now. I mean, today's news was obnoxious that they're starting again with the Russiagate with Bernie and I mean, it's just obnoxious. I'm so sorry Ray McGovern couldn't come here so he could tell us what's really going on, you know. So anyway, great to be here.
Any other comments?
I had just a quick
turn it around.
question.
Should I take it?
No, it's okay. It's just a question. I want if you could comment on. We know that great power conflict is not the answer. What is the vision of what we should be looking for in terms of our relationship with Russia and China? So we know what we're fighting for.
I think this is our message of time.
There's
so
a
we
lot
will
of pizza downstairs.
Let's just wrap everybody.
Right. We're now turning to the panel. I know there's far more questions that have been asked than can possibly be dealt with. As I said, we're going to be dealing with this in a little bit more depth, or have a little more time, maybe not too much, on Monday evening at the Solidarity Center. And so we could see that as the next part of a continuing conversation. So let me actually turn, should we do this in the same order or
sure,
reverse
just do it, let's
order?
do it.
What would, any
Yeah, same order, yeah,
preference
go ahead.
of the panelists? Okay.
So I will speak very briefly. As a huge question that you've asked is, you know, what is China's economy like? What is the nature of China? I think it's in development. I encourage people to see a film called The Wandering Earth, which is a Chinese science fiction movie. And what the Earth is in an orbit of destruction. And what they do is they bring all the people of the world together, and they try to use the gravity of Jupiter to pull the Earth out of its orbit so that it can go into the future to another solar system where it will have a new utopian vision. It's a metaphor there, I think. I'm going to speak very briefly. China has long-term planned economic development for the common good, which capitalist economies abhor. It is not a financialized rentier economy, which all capitalist economies tend or trend towards. It has public ownership of all land,
Right.
infrastructure, 60% of corporations, which no capitalist economy has. It has almost a recession-free economic development, which no capitalist economy has achieved. It has virtual elimination of poverty, hunger, illiteracy, which no capitalist economy has achieved. It has an explicit commitment to ecological and sustainable development written into its constitution, which no capitalist economy will commit to. It has the creation of public wealth and infrastructure and shares this with its neighbors, which capitalists never do. It has a scientific approach to development through its trial spots, and capitalist development tends to be anarchic and very superstitious. And one more piece, which is interesting. It has not gone through the classical model of primitive accumulation, which capitalist economies use as their basis. That is to say, it has not started with slavery, it has not started with colonization. And the other thing that you need to see in the developing world, different form of primitive accumulation is gender-based sexual exploitation in the sex trafficking industry. That's a key part of the primitive accumulation that you see all over the third world. China hasn't done that. Okay? So there are some questions we can ask, but China breaks the mold in important and significant ways, and it's a very, very important discussion to have, and I welcome its continuation, and I direct people to read some of the discussions that are on Monthly Review, etc.
Thank you. So I'm from Hong Kong, China, so I can talk about what is in Riot because some of my brother's family member also were a really hardcore supporter and involved in that. And so Hong Kong was the British colony. So what they want, so that's always has been a very strong right-wing forces in Hong Kong, and it's a very militant and also very pro-U.S. It's just like if I putting like in Iran a perspective, just like Iran, and then there's Mujahideen, terrorist groups in Iraq, the same thing. So. That only because that's the reason even the name when I said at the beginning I call Hindley is a colonial name, that because that is what colonial British master that I should name. It's not using the original pinyin, the Han way to pronounce Li Xiaoshe. So that means that always a racist, fascist element and also CIA back. So in Hong Kong, one of the very simple things, interesting thing, they always has Hong Kong is a stepping stone from mainland China to the Western world during the embargo, but also Hong Kong has been the stepstone for the CIA to infiltrate mainland China. Yes. So it's for the military that if you're going back to all this crazy 007 movie, the James Bond always using Hong Kong as stepping stone for an anti-communist project. That's what this Hong Kong has been for decades. That's the and also Hong Kong has been proud, right-wing Hong Kongers has been proud to say that they are the best Chinese in the world. They are going to be democratize whole mainland China. And that's that going back to 1989, the counter-revolution incidents, Hong Kong was the base to material, financial, political support for all these situations happening in Hong Kong, in mainland China. So going back, what is a counter-revolution Hong Kong riot? The same thing. Two things. They want to be just a bogus ties that Hong Kong will be independent, the whole country will be, the Xinjiang or Tibet will be falling to suit, Taiwan will fall to suit, the same thing, and they're going to falling apart. There's always some kind of, I say always a white man fantasy from CIA what that's going to happen. And then number two is a minimum that can unify every right-wing Hong Kongers, which is always has been I've said a lapdog for the British colonists, and they don't care about anything but themselves, and not then become a very hyper political rise and become some kind of SS Nazi guts, and they can go into thinking about they're going to infiltrate mainland China. That is the whole idea. So
And then going back, because of the time very short, I'm going to start about capitalism because we have been in delegation and then Lila going with me. And then one of the interesting thing is we went to a crazy Maoist organization. And if you see the photo down there, you see that it's really, really fun. And the name of it's a grassroots, it's not official. It's called Mao Zedong for Shining Forever Memorial Association. It's fun, right? Mao Zedong fought for Shining Forever Memorial Association.
It's a long name.
That's right. So like even the headquarters had like a Chairman Mao's photos and Xi Jinping photo with big Chairman Mao statues, and then it's just like a shrine, like some kind of weird shrine, kind of that. But they said that we're Mao Zedong forever. We love cultural revolutions and all that kind of revolution forever. But we also love capitalism. We also love market economy. Let's do business together. And so you got to understand the dynamic, because of maybe for typical Western point of view, you think about that's a crazy idea. Why does a Maoist form free market economies club exist? But that makes sense for a historical cultural perspective. Maybe future I can talk a little bit more. That's the reality. On one hand, they might be talking about left-wing radical, revolutionary, Maoism, whatever. We love cultural revolution, etc., etc. But we also love to have our own private economy and then a business and go to IPO business, etc. So that's all this thing talk about IPO every day in China more than here. And last thing, and then. And Xinjiang, because I want to analyze it. And we also went to Xinjiang. And then the last delegation, we just back January 20th. I'm back to here. And the Xinjiang Uyghur, but Xinjiang is not just only Uyghur, but also have Han, also have Kazakh, also Uzbekistan. There's a yes. And there are all these different ethnic groups. And the Uyghurs, the city, we see that it's a very modern events, and the people live and work together very peaceful. There's nothing like and then chopping each other head off. There's nothing happened that way. And I was right before I said that there's a separatist movement. That's really is going back to the Cold War. They want to just serialize the Xinjiang region. So then many of them be sponsored by the Syria, just like Turkey and CIA, and then also send it to training in in Syria to become ISIS fighters, several thousand. And that has been they want to have all these kind of terrorist attacks, all that kind of thing. That's the reason why very tense the fear about the terrorist attack and that have been happening a few years ago. Now it's much better. And another thing is about why there's not much Chinese announced. Come on, there's plenty more than that. I said like there's enough media, but the problem is a translation. Majority of them are in Chinese. And even right now, the coronavirus, if you there's like I would say like a bullshit that Chinese media is covering up. If you're reading, if you're going to the YouTube of Chinese media, it's just 24/7 talking about all this story, just bombarding every day, and then but they're all in Chinese. It's not in English. So you should if translation or maybe figure out some way we can communicate better is very important. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, as we wind up this session, and this has really been, as I say, an incredible discussion and also of learning things, and I will correct myself in the future that we will say Li Su-hin.
No, Li Su-hin is Li is my last name.
That's what I mean. So we should absolutely.
Yeah, we want to be an official. I mean, suppose Li Xiaoshan.
Okay.
Li Xiaoshan.
Yes, we will.
Not now. Let's get this finished.
We will correct that. And I also want to make a point about even the publications. All kinds of things are in change, in transition, deeply in China as they grapple with their. How to go forward, and there are many currents in China. But what we have seen, particularly, I think, and I'm just saying this as my comments, with the coronavirus, is that there is the ability of the government as a whole and the party mobilized to focus on an issue. And in terms of a virus, if you quarantine a whole population, and you say at the same time that rents are frozen, Credit card payments are frozen. Any kind of payments at all are frozen. Food stores stay open and are fully stocked. There's no capitalist government in the world that would ever be willing to freeze any kind of payments. There are tens of thousands of landlords, of credit card companies, the banks, who would not allow this to happen. So even though there are capitalists and there are billionaires and millionaires in China today, the 90 million strong Communist Party in any mobilization has shown that that is the force that makes the decisions in China. And I think there has been a fundamental change on that. I wanted to say I was very excited because this was in the China Daily on Friday, and that is an article that I wrote on that socialism and the socialist basis of China was the best way to combat the coronavirus, and they reviewed that whole article in China Daily on Friday's paper. So it shows this is a continuing discussion within China, what all this means and how to cope with new situations. And I think we should see that also, this rich change that's going on. I'm going to give Kevin the last word on this.
I'll be very brief.
We have a few minutes. But.
This was, first off, fantastic comments from everybody. And I'm trying, thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about what you're all saying. And when World War III came up several times, and great power conflict, is that like another way to say World War III? That's the U.S. policy.
It is.
The great U.S. policy is World War III. And the nuclear race, the outer space race, that's part of preparation for World War III. It may happen in the second half of this century. Who knows when it's going to happen. And the Hong Kong conflict, down the road, in 2047, when the transition to China is complete, there's going to be incredible conflict there about making that final transition. And if you don't know, if you look at a map and see where Hong Kong is, you'll understand why it's so important. If Hong Kong becomes a place where U.S. Navy can be, or U.S. military bases can be, it's just a very powerful place to fight World War III. And then the other thing I think that's so important is the climate crisis, which I think, Alice, great you mentioned that, because we get so caught up in the military and the hybrid war that's ongoing, but the climate crisis is ongoing too.
Right.
It's happening. And I think it's so important that also answers your question, Margaret. What's the alternative to great power conflict? It's great power cooperation. And in fact, it's not just great power cooperation, but cooperation with the smaller countries as well, because many of those smaller countries are the ones going to be most impacted by the climate crisis. And if we do cooperate around confronting the climate crisis, that diminishes the chance for World War III. And Howie Hawkins, who was mentioned in a derogatory way here, is someone who I'm actually a press secretary for, because I think what's great about Hawkins is that he was the first candidate to ever run on the Green New Deal. He's put forward an eco-socialist Green New Deal as a national position that includes transition to a peace economy and includes nationalization of many major corporations, especially the fossil fuel corporations, and also development of a workers' bill of rights. And so I think that framework, if we can get that into the narrative in this campaign, that would be very powerful. If Sanders' supporters would say, why aren't you saying eco-socialist green? Why aren't you saying peace economy? Why are you saying this nonsense about Venezuela? Use Hawkins' positions to push the best of all the Democrats, which is Sanders. And Hawkins says that. Sanders has the best Green New Deal. It's inadequate. It's not consistent with the science. He's talking about 2050 and beyond. We've got to be talking about 2030. We've got to be talking about the present tense more than the future tense when we deal with the climate. He's not talking, he mentions cutting the military, but isn't not specific about it. And so I think we need to find ways to make that the narrative. The world needs to come together to deal with the climate crisis and avoid the nuclear catastrophe that's on hair trigger alert right now.
That's the bottom
and if you look at Hawkins on nuclear weapons, he's really solid. That's an issue he was very concerned about well before running for president, and getting off hair trigger alert is one of the first steps. So I think we got to start to strive for cooperation and not conflict among great powers and among the broader community of nations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for everyone who came. I think even I want to watch the video. I want to catch